Good morning. I want to make sure that the folks in the back of the room and the folks in the front of the room can hear me all right. I'm getting some head nods. Can I get some thumbs up? Good. I like audience participation. This goes much faster when you participate. So as Betty mentioned, a couple of things about me. I am by trade a sign language interpreter, and I also have this other background in and have had a history in politics and campaigns. But most largely, it's all kind of been related to the LGBTQ movement. How many of you have been in Oregon for longer than 20 years? All right, so you know a little bit about some LGBTQ history and what we've had to endure and suffer through here in Oregon. So I'll talk a little bit more about that just for a blip. But today, this is really a presentation to give you more information about terminology, because terminology keeps changing so fast in relation to the LGBTQ community. So thought that might be really helpful for you to know. And we'll just kind of kick it off from there. So a little bit about who I am. I am a native Oregonian. I graduated as a Viking from North Salem High School back in the 1900s, as I like to say. I identify as a lesbian-identified, bisexual, feminist. I also identify as queer. I am cisgender female. And I am faculty at Western Oregon University, and I also coordinate a federal grant focused on interpreting, specifically interpreting with deaf-blind individuals. But I also teach for our sociology department, LGBTQ studies. And I've been a trainer for the better part of over 15 years for GLSEN, which is a national organization, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And those training and curriculum I've brought and introduced to Western Oregon University, and we use that for our Safe Zone program to educate students, faculty, and staff around terminology and understanding of the LGBTQ culture and community. I have been a professional homosexual in the sense of I have worked in our LGBTQ civil rights movement on a state level and on a national level for over 2 decades, and have volunteered in this community for a very long time. This is my topic area, this is my passion. I hope you'll ask questions, and we'll give you an opportunity. If you've seen a piece of paper coming around, I hope you'll write down a question. This is a topic area where people, I have found, and maybe this won't be your experience, but I have found people don't want to say something that they think could be perceived as offensive. And so I give you an opportunity to write down questions anonymously, and then I'll collect them. Most of the time I answer them through the course of the presentation, but if not, we certainly save time at the end to address your questions. I like to make sure we're kind of all on the same page, so I'm going to ask for a visual thumbs up when we go through this list. But really, essentially, here to have some shared understandings as we go forward. First, here to share information. Hopefully, it will be helpful and useful to you. And I value respect in the communication and in your questions. This is also meant to be a safe and non-judgmental environment for you to ask questions if you have them. And your participation is very much welcomed. Apparently, I have a weird thing in my PowerPoint there. Some of you may know information about this topic, and please contribute. The last 3 are bolded because it's really important that we make sure that we know about this. In this room today, no one's sexual orientation or gender identity or expression will be assumed. I've already come out to you, so you know mine. But we don't want to presume that about anyone else unless they self-identify and volunteer that information. Maybe you know, you're like, well, I totally know this person's sexual orientation, or I think I know their gender identity. But for today, until they self-identify, let's hold with, we don't necessarily know. We may think we know, because our eyes have categorized that information for a very long time. There's fluidity around sexual and gender identity and expression. We're no longer working in a binary world of straight or not straight. There are a lot of different identities around sexual orientation and gender identity, and we'll unpack some of those today. And lastly, I hope you can get on board with this. Every person is entitled to love, understanding, empathy, support, dignity, and respect. Oh, I love that. I've never gotten applause on that. So that sounds like tacit agreement, but can I get a visual thumbs up that we can proceed and we're good on this? People feel good? I'm still looking at your, okay, good, rock on, we're gonna have a good time. Okay, so this is your chance. I'm going to give you just a few moments to jot down if you have a question. I'd like to ask people if they'd be willing, who kind of volunteers for the room, to just kind of collect your questions. But if you have a burning question, write it down. If you're like, I got this, CM. If you weren't here, I'd be up there teaching on this. Then that's great. Then tell me, rock on. It's going to be a beautiful day. Or I can't wait for this weekend, whatever. But I want you to write something so that it doesn't look totally obvious that like one person's asking 4 questions. So take a few moments. Okay, we're going to go on, but you can keep asking questions, and we'll maybe check in at the break and collect more questions. But already, I know I'm going to answer a lot of your questions, so we're in good shape with the time we have. Thank you. Yeah, what does that long list of words mean? So we're going to do a little quiz and just kind of test your knowledge, okay? I bet you'll get some of these. So the goals for today are really to give you an understanding of what terminology is presently used. And I say presently because the language does evolve and change. And words that we used 20 years ago are words we don't use anymore. And words that we used 20 years ago that were offensive then have been reclaimed. So I want to give you a sense of what those terms are. And then also help you to know like how to educate and inform others. Like, well, I know that this term is culturally appropriate, and so you can do some education as well. But really, we want to give you a sense of what the right terms are. So let's do this. Let's test this out, right? Okay, what do we think the L is? Great. G? B? T? Some of the end of the word, people are like, I'm not 100% sure, but we'll go over that. The first Q. Second Q? What? I think some people are questioning the second Q. I? Oh, we've got some gold star students in the room. Intersex, we'll talk about that. The first A? Asexual. The second A? Awesome, right? No, it's not awesome. But it is, let's be honest. No, it's ally. And we'll talk about all these terms. So, ally, A-L-L-Y, ally. We're going to cover all the terms. Like ally, like supporter. Okay. Can I get a show of hands? How many of you are, or know someone, or love someone who holds one or more of these identities? Anyone not know anyone? Oh, the times, they are a-changin'. Okay, so we're going to break down terms because that LGBTQ alphabet soup gets all jumbly-mumbly. We're going to really focus in on talk about terms related to sexual orientation, and then we're going to put that aside and we're going to talk about terms related to gender identity and expression, and then we'll talk about some other community-related terms. These terms should be more familiar to you. These are terms related to sexual orientation. First let's talk about attraction, right? It's not all physical. There are all these ways that we are attracted to other people. There's aesthetic attraction, sensual attraction. Like you just have this, it's not sexual, but you will hug them, or you connect with someone and you want to cuddle them. There's that intellectual chemistry, like we totally vibe each other, intellectual attraction. Those emotional attraction, these are the people who you go to, you tell your deepest, darkest to, but you may not have a sexual relationship with them, right? These are friendships. We can talk about it as in that way if that helps you to think about attraction. But then there's always that romantic attraction, that thumpa, 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 and sexual attraction. We may hold all of these different types of attraction for the same person, but I would bet that we hold a lot of these different types of attraction for a lot of different people. Because we think about our friendships, and I'm like, oh my God, I want to hug, I want to hold my friend's hand, but we're just friends. But then there's someone who I get Twitter-pated about, and I want to get to know them more, right? And so it's like, well, I might want to ramp up the different types of attraction I have for this person. We hold lots of different ways of attraction for people, is really kind of the premise and the foundation of how people are attracted to one another. So we all have a sexual orientation. I said we all do. A lot of people think, oh, only LGBT people, but people who are heterosexual also hold a sexual orientation. Alfred Kinsey, who was a sex researcher in the 1950s, studied men's sexual patterns and behavior. And he extrapolated a scale, a spectrum, if you will, to gauge men's sexual patterns, and then it was later kind of overlaid on women's activities and patterns and attraction. And what it really is it's about how we are attracted to another. And that it is not exclusively heterosexual, and it's not exclusively homosexual, but that there were more than incidental moments of attraction to someone of the opposite sex. So 0, the scale started at 0 and it went to 6. 0 was exclusively heterosexual behavior, exclusively heterosexual thought patterns, exclusively interested in someone of the opposite sex. And then 6, people who were solely attracted, interested, wanted to engage in relationships with someone of the same sex. But it wasn't just 2, it wasn't a binary, that there were these shades of gray in between. And so now we look at some of the research, and some of the research now shows that exclusively homosexual, right, people who are gay and lesbian, that's about 12%, could be up to 12 to 15% of the population. Some people say that folks who are bi is about 20 to 25%, but you don't necessarily know that they're bi because they might be in an opposite sex relationship, and so they're perceived as heterosexual, or they might be in a same-sex relationship, or they might be perceived as lesbian or gay. So the bi folks are definitely invisibilized in this spectrum very often. And then we know that there's a majority of people who are heterosexual. And because we talked about all those ways of attraction, that does change over time. I do hear stories on a weekly basis of people who had a very successful, beautiful, wonderful relationship with someone, either of the same sex or the opposite sex, and then they found a different way that they were attracted to someone. And it was the opposite, like someone who they maybe had been in a very successful and loving relationship with someone of the opposite sex, and then found that chemistry, that connection with someone of the same sex. And that's completely individualized. And there's no science that says this is the way it is, period, for all, because people are as individual as the rainbow. So some of you may have heard the terms LGBTQ. This is one of the ways it gets written with an asterisk because the T, the transgender term, has so many different breakout terms underneath it. And that plus is just because there's a number of, we are going to own the alphabet eventually. We are going to be able to take over the entire alphabet. But I think if you're just saying LGBT, LGBTQ, there's no, it has to be the G first. If you, short of ordering a BLT sandwich, I think if your effort is in trying to include some of the letters, you're in good shape. And this is essentially saying someone who's not necessarily heteronormative or not necessarily gender normative. So some of the ways you might see it written: LGBTQ, GLBT. I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to let you in on a secret. Some of my best friends, wait for it, are straight. What? Get this, my parents, straight. Yeah. So we think about attraction, and we think about all the ways that we're attracted to one another we already talked about, and some of our people that we love in our lives. How many of you know, love, or are straight people? Okay, way to be proud, way to come out. I support you, I support your identity. Right? So we need to know, it's important to know and own your own identity, and also to be able to recognize and dignify others. These are the terms that are probably the most familiar to you. Gay, that's often been an umbrella term, a blanket term, to talk about anybody in the queer community. It doesn't include trans folks, but it is a term to also talk about men and their identity, but it can also be an inclusive term for the queer community. Lesbian, we're familiar with this term, right? Bisexual, someone who's attracted not necessarily equally to men and women. And this is a bit of an older term now. You're starting to see this term evolve out and a new term take its place. But when I came out, back in the 1900s, this was the term, right? So I read a lot of the queer texts at the time, and this term felt really appropriate for me because I knew my attraction was not for the form of the person, but what was in their heart, what was in their mind, how I was connecting to them emotionally, that was more meaningful to me. And so bisexual felt like a really good fit for me. And it may not necessarily be, at the same time, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what your relationship construct looks like. Because there are bisexual people who are single, there are bisexual people who are married. Again, bisexual folks are often invisibilized. But this term is now evolving out, and the younger population has claimed a new term. So are you ready for some new hip terminology? Okay. Pansexual. So when you look at your phone and it has that photo taking, option of pano, right? And you can take that whole panoramic. That's the idea, is that my attraction is open to anyone. It's about the hearts, not the parts. And it's essentially falling in love with the person and being gender blind or gender free, which is essentially a more evolved definition of bisexuality. So you might hear the kids today use the term pansexual, and you're like, oh yeah, I totally know what that term is. Yeah, that's the more updated bisexual term or something like that. Feel free to use that and throw your knowledge down, and they'll be very impressed with you. How many of you had heard this term before? Okay, all right, got it. Asexual. While some will say this is not necessarily a sexual orientation, the lack of having an interest and attraction to another, well, we can qualify that and couch that as a sexual orientation or lack thereof. This is a group of folks who don't necessarily have a drive, don't necessarily have that interest in having a sexual relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're celibate, doesn't necessarily mean that at all. They may have meaningful companionate relationships, but they're just not, and they may still have sex. It's just not necessarily something that they're particularly motivated by or driven by. I'm going to show you YouTube, and it has captioning. There's also an organization, or excuse me, like a website that you can look at for more information on asexuality. So I'm going to click to that, and hopefully it's going to work without an ad. Let's see if it works without an ad. Nope, we get an ad.
Asexuality is an orientation in which
Hang on, folks. I just want to make sure that the captioning is working.
Sexual attraction.
Heterosexuality is attraction
Nope,
to
we're good.
opposite.
We're just going to start it again.
Asexuality is an orientation in which the individual does not experience sexual attraction.
Heterosexuality is attraction to opposite gender. Homosexuality is attraction to the same gender.
I'm not interested in having sexual contact with a male or female or any gender.
Asexuality is very much not the same thing as being celibate.
Celibacy is a choice.
Planning for the future for someone that you want to save yourself for.
Asexuality is a sexual orientation and therefore not a choice.
No, I have not experienced arousal to date.
Some asexual people definitely experience physiological arousal.
Just like everybody else, people have varying levels of libido.
I mean, my nipples get hard if it's cold out, but not sexually.
Just because they don't want to do anything with it doesn't necessarily mean that the equipment isn't all in functioning order.
It depends on the person again.
It's usually not quite a sexual thing, it's more of just like a physical thing.
I'm told it's a natural thing. I just have never tried it, don't think I will.
Because otherwise everyone would say we were straight and like keep treating us as straight.
It doesn't define me, but it is a part of me. And I feel like any close friends that I have, I would want them to know. I told my parents, just because they were bothering me about like, why don't you have a boyfriend? And I'm like, I don't want a boyfriend or a girlfriend or anything.
Your romantic orientation is completely separate from your sexual orientation.
Just because you're asexual doesn't mean that you are not interested in people romantically.
You know, biromantic, homoromantic, all of that stuff is on top of being asexual. For that, I would say It's definitely dependent on the two people or more than two people involved in that relationship.
I mean, some asexuals will have sex with their partners. I've done sex with my partners.
Asexual people and the ace community tend to have this pressure that they have to conform and they have to have sex in order to make their partners happy when that's not true.
I'd much rather just like eat ice cream and watch a movie. It'd definitely be nice to be acknowledged a little more.
People don't really know what asexuality is, and then we have to go on and explain, and then they make these assumptions.
We're just normal people, just like everyone else.
Great. Dave? I mean, I would rather eat ice cream and watch a movie sometimes, right? But that's human. So it's sometimes better to hear from people with that identity than to have me talk to you. So sometimes I have like little clips to give you that perspective. All right, well, let's talk about the Q that everyone wonders about. Just a show of hands, how many of you feel like this is a term that I feel 100% comfortable using out there? Okay. That's really human and really common. How many of you feel like this term has been really stigmatized? Because I remember hearing smear the queer on the playground growing up. You bet. And it is a term that has been reclaimed. So I think part of it is the practice of saying it, and every term that you use in general, so much about how you use it matter. What's really important is time, place, manner, and intent, right? So if you're saying you effing queer, it's a very different statement than, oh, did you go to the Queer People of Color conference? More neutral, totally fine. Didn't have that tinge. But I completely get that that feels like a term that feels weird and iffy to use. And I say, you can use it. It's a word that you can use, again, time, place, manner, intent. What do you want to say when you're trying to use it? I will tell you, there are a lot of people in the LGBTQ community who still have that kind of negative reaction to the term. And I used to say it cut across age lines. I used to say, like, older LGBT people didn't really feel comfortable with the term. Younger folks definitely across the board, are very open to this term, very comfortable with this term, and often use this term intentionally as a point of education. If they're going to use that term, they're letting you know that they're ready to engage in some conversation about it. Like, that's almost like a, you want to talk about this kind of term. And I used to say older folks didn't really use this term. And then I had the great opportunity in my life to meet Edie Windsor. Have you heard of Edie Windsor? She's about 90 now, a lesbian from New York. And in 2013, the United States versus Windsor was the case that won marriage for LGBTQ folks. She had been with her longtime partner, Thea, and Thea was very ill, and they got married in New York, but they had a tax penalty, a federal tax penalty of just under $400,000 because the federal government had long not recognized LGBTQ relationships, even as sanctioned by the state. And at that time, it was still a patchwork. More and more states were coming online in terms of recognizing same-sex relationships. But 45 years in, I think we know that there are some celebrity marriages that don't last a good 2 months, but they were able to reap all of those federal tax benefits. So that was what was really the cause that created the Supreme Court to rule. And she used queer. And I was like, all right, if Edie Windsor is going to use queer, I am not putting this on age lines anymore, even though my experience and data had really shown me that this was an age thing. Nope. Edie Windsor was comfortable using queer. I'm going with, you can use queer. So what does it mean? Well, it's a term to really talk about anyone of any sexual orientation that is not heteronormative, and also kind of it can include the T in the term, and that just feels like a not heteronormative, not necessarily gender normative term, but absolutely reclaimed. And even if you don't identify in the community, this is a term you can use because we just talked about what's your meaning, what's your intent by by which you're actually using this term. I will give you that permission to use that term if you can come up with a good context to use it. Homophobia. The fear, hatred, discomfort with people who love someone or are attracted to someone of the same sex. So I ask, what does homophobia look like? And this is an audience participation moment. What does it look like? What do we think of when we think of homophobia? Oh yeah, sorry Dave, hold on one second. People are being respectful not to comment, I'm gonna guess. What does homophobia look like, folks? Oh yeah, Dave. Okay. Sorry.
I think it's when people come into a room. Okay. I think it's when people come into a room and you see one standing back on the side by the wall who will not touch, who will not talk, who make you feel uncomfortable in your own skin. I've seen it before, and I'm sure I'll see it again. So that's what I think of homophobia.
Okay. Thanks. What does homophobia look like? Kathy in the front. People afraid of homosexuals. Look like? How do we manifest that fear? What is the fear in action? I guess what I want to kind of tease out of you. Yeah, something's good. I can repeat your comment as well.
Not working very well.
Here and then over here. Many forms. Oh, you can see it in Portland, like where the bakery wouldn't make the cake for the lesbian couple that wanted to get married. Mm-hmm. Is my mic still on? Okay, great. Fear is because people don't understand that it's really generated out of fear. Was there a comment over? Yeah.
This is Anne. It looks like Matthew Shepard, and it looks like bathrooms not being available to trans people.
And that would be an example of transphobia. Mm-hmm.
And it looks like a kid in school harassing another kid.
So we all know the Matthew Shepard story, yes? Is there anyone who's like, and it's interesting because teaching at a university, the age of those students, they have no idea who Matthew Shepard is. And that's into my brain from just 20 years ago, that they have we're littles, we're little kiddos, they have no idea. So I have to tell them this, like, yeah, someone was beaten and left to die, tied up like a scarecrow on the side of a fence in Wyoming. And they're like, what? That happened? Because they are living in an entirely different reality as they've seen this last 20 years in terms of advancements, what they feel are palpable advancements. And yet I would say that we still have some active homophobia in a way that feels very blinding and suffocating, which I'm going to continue to talk about in a minute. The military and the Boy Scouts. And the military now, we know that they've repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, so LGBT and T individuals can openly serve our country. We'll see how that continues. We'll take one or two more comments.
Right here. Hello.
Hi there. Hi, Marion.
I'm Marion Dearman. One of the most famous cases of homophobia was Oscar Wilde, who was one of the best writers in the English language. And he was doing his thing for many years till finally somebody outed him, and he wound up in prison. I think he died in prison because of his sexuality.
Thank you. Check, check.
Can't get any. Oh, there we go. I was just going to say, prejudiced. It's like, yikes. It's the feeling.
The feeling of being contagious. Like gay people, if you touch them, get it too. You're going to get. The movie American Beauty, and if you remember that movie and the internalized homophobia that was going on that you may have seen at the end of that film. Yeah. We'll call it for now, but we'll come back to this. So I want to give you just kind of a breadth of an understanding of how I see homophobia. And maybe, you can think about my background in politics, but right now, we have marriage equality in all 50 states for all couples. How many states can those couples legally, can gay, lesbian, and bi couples legally be fired for being gay? Can legally be asked it in an employment interview? Can legally be denied access to housing? I feel like this is not on, but I want to make sure it is. Can legally be denied access to public accommodations? And I want to be really clear about public accommodations. That means a restaurant, a movie theater, the froyo place that you want to go to. How many states can you legally be fired or not hired or discriminated against if you are lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual? How many? High end is 50, right? We know 50 is the top number. So what do we want to guess? 25 states you can legally be fired, not hired? Nope. States have their own individual laws, and at this point, 30 states you can legally be fired or not hired if you are lesbian, gay, or bi. Does that not, it surprises the heck out of me too. Let's look at this. If I can open I'm going to show you a map. And this is just called the Movement Advancement Project, and it's just a map that we're going to blow up a little bit. But do you see where it's a dark green on this map? Those are states that have protections that include both sexual orientation and gender identity. So that means lesbian, gay, bi, and trans people are protected. Is Oregon one of those states? You bet, since 2007. And you can see that there are a lot of states that are kind of light in color. And there are 3 states that have that yellow triangle that's like, do not go to this state. Those states have actively passed laws that say, don't even try in your local municipality to pass a non-discrimination ordinance. You are forbidden from passing a local non-discrimination ordinance. To me, that's homophobia. We know that the majority of lawmakers are heterosexual, as I would guess most of you are. And I think that the power in how we combat homophobia is we talk to the lawmakers. And you talk to your family and friends who live in other states. Because I feel really bad for my friends in Arkansas and Tennessee and North Carolina. North Carolina, I don't know if you've seen the news in the last year, but they've had some stuff going on around their laws. It's been pretty tenuous for the LGBTQ population who live there. Surprising, right? A lot of people, I will tell you, the students that I talk to think all 50 states have all the laws. And they're stunned by this. I guess the next question is, what do we do to combat homophobia? Because it's fear. It's discomfort. It's dislike. That's what it is. So that's enshrined homophobia in the state. So biphobia, it's not like, oh my God, there's a bi person. But it's the presumption that your identity isn't legitimate. It's that you're either straight and then you are at a phase of bisexuality on your way to being gay, or it's that bi-curious phase, one time in college kind of thing, but you're not legitimately attracted to people based on who the person is. There's also this idea that people are promiscuous because they might be engaging in all these multiple relationships, or that they're indecisive and they're like, well, I'm with you right now, but whoa, that person just walked by, see you later. This is a lot of biphobia out there. And that they are the ones who promulgate STDs. Inaccurate, but still some assumptions, some stereotyping about bi people. Okay, so we've talked about the terms related to sexual orientation. We're going to talk about the terms related to that T, right? LGBT. We're going to talk about terms related to gender identity and expression. So first off, everyone has a biological sex. It's all those chromosomal elements and hormonal elements of who you are. It is your external and internal reproductive organs. It's all that makes you XX or XY. It's that physical self, male, female, or intersex. And it's more externally determined because what happens, the doctor yanks you and says, it's a girl or it's a boy. We know now pre-birth, like what the sex of the child is, but we still have that moment of, it's really externally based. And then we get all our colors coordinated accordingly. So everybody has a biological sex, and everybody has a gender identity. Gender identity is innate. Gender identity is that psychological sense of self. And that's more internally determined, how you think, feel, act. Just your sense of who you are, right? We have long assumed it was a binary of male-female. And now it's definitely more evolved that we see more of a gender spectrum and a gender fluidity. I asked the question before in more in specifics of how many of you I know, love, or are someone, or know someone who's LGBTQ, but let's get more specific here. How many of you know, how many of you are, or how many of you love someone who may be on the gender spectrum, who may identify as trans? This number is coming up. More people are knowing people who are trans identified. So right now, my current partner was born female, identifies with male pronouns, and I'm still queer identified. He is queer identified, may present to you as someone who maybe you'd read as like a really butch, masculine of center lesbian, but he is very much guy identified. And that's his gender identity. He knew psychologically he didn't fit with a female body. And we're starting to hear and see stories of people who younger and younger are knowing I am not a girl or I am not a boy. And for us to listen to that and listen to those kids who are proclaiming this identity is powerful. So let's think about this. We all have a biological sex. I was born female. My psychological sense of self, I internally, I think, feel, and act female, right? Those are in alignment for me. And probably for a good number of you too. How many of you have heard this term before? You are such gold star students. I love you all. So this is pronounced cisgender, or the shortcut, cis. This is a new term to really essentially say not transgender. So remember, my biological sex is female. My gender identity is female. I am cisgender. Cisgender is the gender norm. Most of you probably don't think about that term, but again, it's important for us to know our own identity so we can think about our identity in relation to others. So cis or cisgender, again, a term that would totally make you hip with the kids. Because you're like, oh yeah, I know I'm cis. I know I'm a cis-het person, or I know I'm cis, queer, or whatever. So again, we're talking about terms related to gender identity. Cis is a term related to gender identity. Queer is a term that relates to sexual orientation, but it could relate to gender too. It's essentially a match between your biological sex and your psychological sense of self. For 99% of the population, we are cisgender. It's really easy to invisibilize those that we don't see when you're in the 1% or less. But it's important for us to recognize that because the 99%, we do reap a lot of privilege from that identity, and to know how we can be supports to people who may not have those easy access points when their gender does not comport with their biological sex. But someone who's comfortable in the gender they were assigned at birth. I'm comfortable with the gender I was assigned at birth. Are you comfortable with the gender you were assigned at birth? Maybe. What we hear trans people's experiences, they say, I'm in the wrong body. I feel like I'm in the wrong body. And you hear that again and again. That's a very common thread among trans individual stories, is wrong body. And that gender dysphoria, just looking in the mirror and being like, this is not the person that I think of myself as. And wanting to figure out how to fix and right what you know internally about yourself, and not having a society that really understands your identity makes that much more of a challenge. Some people like to get all grammatical, so they want to know that it's Latin on the same side as cis. So I just mentioned gender dysphoria, and that's that sense of you feel like your psychological identity does not match with your biological sex. So that's that internal struggle, and for many people, over many years, that is internal, and they do not externalize that. They do not communicate that, because that is not a common experience. We know that Caitlyn Jenner had a very successful career and life, and it took forever for her to come out and say, this is who I am. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't understand that. Sure you don't understand that. 99% of the people wouldn't necessarily just be like super hip to understand that. And I get that that's a learning curve for people. I absolutely do. And how brave and courageous to risk that. And Caitlyn has a tremendous amount of privilege and wealth. But there are so many trans people who don't. And they still brave that. Even when it means alienation from family, friends. There are trans people who live in those states that do not have any protections. How brave that they come out to say, I'm in the wrong body. I gotta do something about this. We all have gender expression, right? So today I femmed it up for you. You're welcome. And I put on some jewelry, I hope you've noticed, and lip color and all that. But that's not necessarily my everyday, right? You know, and that's just because I knew I was going to be presenting to you today. And we all have, and gender expression is a spectrum. It doesn't necessarily fall along sex lines, because we know that there are those days that we're like, I'm just going to be in yoga pants for the entire week, you know? And I might not shower until Wednesday. It's fine, we're good with that. You know, no makeup, all that stuff. That's gender expression. There are days that we get all fancified for an event. There are days that we all get done up. That's gender expression. There are social norms around gender expression, and some of those we've softened around, but they're still very binary. You know, y'all remember the whole 1980s where if a guy pierced his ear on this side, it meant he was cool or gay, but on this side it was cool. You know, but now it's you see football players with long hair, and they're both ears pierced, and they have other things pierced, and it's just how we've moved that line. We still have pretty strict lines around men dress, what you're permitted to wear socially. That's really socially determined culture to culture, but our culture still tugs a really tight line on that. Women have a lot more latitude. I'm guessing the people who identify in this room today, not all of you are wearing flowy dresses like the 1950s, right? We are pants wearers now. Woo, flexibility, it's lovely. So we've moved that line for women. And some of this, you see people express their gender maybe more masculine, more feminine, and you see that in terms of sexual orientation or gender identity. As I mentioned, the person that I'm seeing, when we go out to a restaurant, oftentimes the server will come up to the table and say, "What can I get for you, ladies?" And they did that quick, glance, and I'll correct that, because it's one of the battles I pick, right? I say, well, I think he's gonna order a drink. I just want a soda water. One time, in all the times we've ever gone out, has someone come back to the table and said, "I'm so sorry." And it's just, they're subtle. It's not like, I am not gonna pay this bill and I'm gonna give you a bad Yelp review. No, it's human. People don't know. I have a lot of forgiveness. I have a lot of compassion for people learning. So I think in my nature as an educator, I want you to get it. Because I lived through the 1990s in Oregon. And I lived through a time when I came out and the Oregon Citizens Alliance was evil and hateful and spilling lies about LGBT people. They didn't even talk so much. Well, they talked a lot about T people with so much misinformation. You saw that, right? A lot of you raised your hands. You were here during that time. It was really hard to have a target, not on my back, but like right here during that era and time, and to be out. The kids today, they have it so easy, right? In the sense that they don't know that. But we lived through that. And if you loved people who were LGBT back then, it was a really hard time. I want people to be able to have whatever gender expression they want and feel comfortable in. I want people to be able to feel comfortable in their bodies and not have that policed. All right, we're gonna talk about the T and then we'll go to break. So you can say transgender, you can say trans. Again, hip terminology, trans. So just, your takeaways for the day. This is an umbrella term. There are a lot of terms underneath this term, so that's why trans is just a good fallback, default term to use. But it's essentially someone whose biological sex does not match their psychological sense of self, their gender identity. They may or may not proceed with some kind of transition-related health care to augment their body in a way that fits with their psychological sense of self, because health care is really pricey and often an obstacle for trans individuals. It's perceived as elective. But if you really want to understand the trans experience, it's what's going on between the ears, right? Not what's going on between the legs. Trans people may be straight, lesbian, gay, bi, or pan, or asexual, because again, these are two groups of terms related to gender identity and expression, terms related to sexual orientation. So some of these terms, and this is why there's that little asterisk, is there's so many different terms, and you might meet someone who says, "I identify as gender fluid." That's a conversation starter, not stopper, because that's a place where you can be like, "Tell me what that means to you." Because I might meet someone else who says, "I identify as gender queer," and I still need to say, "Tell me what that means for you." And those people, gender fluid and gender queer, might have very similar definitions, and it's really meet the person where they're at and how they identify and get more information. It's an opportunity for education for yourself. But some of the terms you might hear kind of within this, underneath this umbrella: transsexual, cross-dresser, gender non-conforming. Again, remember, gender as a spectrum and fluidity as opposed to male-female. Folks may identify as a trans man. So trans man is someone who is born biologically female and identifies as a man. Trans woman, someone born biologically male and identifies as female. Gender queer, someone who kind of says, The binary of male, female doesn't apply to me. Gender fluid, kind of the same thing. That they feel like they really want to express their gender in whatever way is their way to express it. And I get that our brains have categorized sex since infancy. It was pink or it was blue, period. I get that our brains do that. That's our society. I'm not trying to say, subvert the dominant paradigm. I'm just saying be mindful that not everyone's going to fall into that paradigm. Non-binary, bigender, androgynous, gender variant. Again, all of these are very specific terms, and the definitions can have a lot of overlay and similarity. So if you meet someone and they say, I identify as gender nonconforming, a follow-up is, tell me what that means for you. So we'll do this, and then we'll go to break. Some common third gender or gender-neutral pronouns. They. How many of you have heard kind of about the new use of they in the singular, and that is now kind of been sanctioned legally by all grammarians, that we're going to be okay with using that in print and for media and all that. Maybe you've heard or seen that. So they is a good third gender pronoun when you might perceive someone does not necessarily identify as male or female, and you're unsure, and sometimes little kids will say, Mommy, is that a girl or a boy? I don't know. What would you do if you didn't know? You could ask. If you were in some kind of situation, you could say, what pronouns do you use? When I teach my classes, I always introduce myself and I share my pronouns. You might absolutely perceive my pronouns, but if I don't tell you, you could make an assumption that could be incorrect. So I always say, hi, my name's CM. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. What are your pronouns? What pronouns do you use? And again, 99% of the population, this is not the non-issue. This is not necessarily something you would think about. But to be mindful of that group of folks who may be gender variant and say, your name is Chris. What pronouns do you use? We all remember the Saturday Night Live sketch with Julia Sweeney, It's Pat, and everyone tiptoed around. We don't want to, do you have a partner? And they just didn't want to ask, and so it was this whole gender non-conforming, we're unsure, so they kind of danced around it the whole time. They never said, Pat, what pronouns do you use? But this has been invented by people who are genderqueer, who are gender fluid, essentially in the trans community, if they don't identify with male, female. Does that mean that all trans people use these pronouns? No. But it's an individual question. If you perceive someone to be genderqueer or trans, it'd be just a good thing to ask, what pronouns do you use? And you can always start with your own. It's a good introduction. I totally recognize that question feels awkward and clunky, and we don't ask it because our brains and our eyes categorize that all the time and have been doing that since birth. And embedded in that question, what pronouns do you use? The layer behind it is, I see you. I want to be respectful. I want to treat you with dignity. Tell me what I can do to make that happen. And that question is a completely appropriate and sanctioned question for people who are trans, because they're like, thank you for asking. Let's take a break here. I'm doing karaoke later tonight. Would you like me to start and practice with you a little bit? No, I'm going to keep going. So one of the pieces of this slide that I emphasized right before the break was to ask the question, what pronouns do you use? A question that came up during the break, and I want to be very clear how we're talking about this. Right now we're kind of under the category of gender identity and expression. I'm hearing a lot of down, down, down. I'm seeing a lot of down. Let's see if this is better. Just keep talking. Just keep talking. Okay. So I want to be very clear that because we're under that heading of gender identity and expression, I'm talking about people who are trans, gender non-conforming, genderqueer, that population of people for whom their biological sex does not align with their psychological sense of self, that group, that subgroup, is about 1%. The group related to sexual orientation, if you remember that Kinsey scale, we're talking about people who are like a 6, if we were to do a 6. People don't classify themselves by a number system. You know, they're not like, I'm a Kinsey 5. But 0 was exclusively heterosexual and 6 exclusively homosexual. 0, about over 50%. And then 6, that kind of exclusively homosexual, is 12, 15%, as high as 12 to 15%. But bi folks can be 20 to 25. It's just that their relationships may not necessarily be perceived as bi because they're either in a relationship with someone of the same sex or someone of the opposite sex. So they're different percentages. A lot of people wonder about what the transition looks like for trans people, like if they're going to undergo procedures to make their biological sex align with their psychological sex. These are costly procedures for people who are born female, who are transitioning in the process. So much of that is access to health care. Is it covered? Most places it's not. It's seen as elective. But for example, the person that I'm dating, born female, has tissue here, planning to have what is called top surgery, and to remove that. You may know someone who's trans who's been able to undergo a number of different procedures. I'm not going to get into the specifics on what procedures, because truthfully, whether or not you've had access to medical care doesn't legitimize or delegitimize your identity as trans. It's how you identify. And there are trans people who are not out as trans. They don't want you to know because maybe they were able to transition and not tell anyone. And they don't, but if you know someone who's trans, that's because they want you to know. That's because there is a point of education that's happening in relating their story, in relating their experience. Because they're such a minority population that we as the majority need to understand their experience more, understand their access and challenges and obstacles to healthcare, accesses to changing and legalize and changing their gender marker on documentation. I think you could probably guess my politics based on my coming here and talking about this, and I'm not going to get into politics, but I will tell you that since November in Oregon, there have been a number of gender ID clinics to help trans people access gender documents that affirm their identity, because there's so few trans protections and there are really so little federally that there were a number of trans people, Oregonians, who were very frightened about what this new administration would mean for them, their ability to access a social security card or a passport or a birth certificate that had their name as they went by and had their gender marker as they went by. So that's a part of that transition process, but so it could be a name change, it could be physical or legal modifications, but all of that is costly. Someone who's a cross-dresser, it's not someone who would fall under, it is someone who would fall in that trans umbrella, right, as one of the terms, but it's not someone who is per se trans. It's someone who, and typically we notice this when it's heterosexual men, who for a part of their psychological sense of being, they need to express their gender in a feminine way. And remember we talked about gender expression is still very binary. We do not have a lot of latitude for men being able to express a feminine gender expression. We're like, you have a t-shirt or a button down, you have ties and pants. That's it, that's all you get. And we don't have a lot of flexibility around that. And when we see that flexibility, we may do a double take or question what that is. And it's not people who want to transition, but a very real part of their identity, a very real part of their gender expression is to express it in a feminine way. A very outdated term that you may have heard from like Phil Donahue in the 80s was transvestite. We don't use that term anymore. The term is cross-dresser. Women have so much more gender expression fluidity. I can go into a men's clothing section of a store. No one's gonna be like, no one's gonna say that. But if a guy is like rifling through the dresses rack, we're like, for his wife, for his girlfriend, for his mistress, for whatever, whatever, right? But we don't think, oh, that could be for him, because he's not necessarily sizing it up in front of a mirror. We just don't have that same flexibility. So women, we don't even notice it. Women cross-dress all the time in the sense of, this shirt was made better, this t-shirt at Target was made better, it's cheaper, and it was in the men's section, right? That may very well happen. And no one blinks. So this is really about just gender expression. Cis-sexism. Cis-sexism is when we assume that everyone is cisgender, right? We assume everyone is born and that is their biological identity, and that's the identity that they carry on for the rest of their life. It's kind of that assumption that people don't, it's kind of the idea that people choose their gender. Like people are choosing to be trans. I mean, I think a lot of people have come around and understand now that there have been challenges for LGB people, and why would you choose to be so discriminated against? And people don't choose that. People still, question this around trans identity. But wait, why are they choosing it so long? If a 4-year-old kid is saying, I'm a girl, not a boy, I think that's something to listen to. A dear friend of mine has a daughter, and her daughter, and she wrote journals to her child, through, infancy, and would write these journals. And when her kid was 4 years old, was saying I know you tell me that you're not a boy, and I should really listen to you. And she read these journals recently. And her kid now is 9 and goes by a female name. She saw all of this happening. She saw all the behaviors, and they were all feminine behaviors that her child was expressing. And even though she was trying to change the course for this kid, no, you're supposed to Lego trucks and all that, and you're not supposed to like the Barbie dolls, trying to write that, but this kid was like, I know who I am. It's powerful. And it's hard for parents to really, change and broaden and expand that idea of what our kids are, of who our kids are. Gender, not based on genitals, right? But cis-sexism does kind of assume that your gender is based on your genitalia. What matters is how one feels and identifies. It's not about what's one's private parts. We don't actually investigate this with our friends. We're not like, I'm going to be friends with you based on your private parts. We don't actually ask people to reveal that, but we still think we have license to police gender when it comes to a gender minority. We talked about homophobia and biphobia, transphobia, the systematic oppression, irrational fear, discomfort for people who don't fit our societal expectations of how they should follow prescribed gender norms. And sometimes that's through ignoring or invalidating their existence, or stereotyping or hate crimes, ranging from verbal harassment to assault, rape, and murder. While we did put on we showed you the map for the employment non-discrimination and where people can be discriminated against in housing and public accommodations, there are more states that trans people are discriminating in. So sexual orientation, we've actually made some advancements, but we're still saying, stay back, trans folks. We're not ready to give them those same privileges and advance their dignity and equality. The group that is the most perpetuated upon are trans women, and more specifically, trans women of color. So can we think of a celebrity who is a trans woman of color? Laverne Cox. If you watch the Netflix series Orange is the New Black, she's the African-American, very tall, drink of water, that is on that series. And she's one person, but she represents so many trans people of color, trans women of color, who actually are not getting those same advances. They're actually more systemically disadvantaged in terms of employment, discrimination, harassment. I'm going to show you some statistics that were actually put out by the state of Oregon a couple of years ago, and these are pretty sobering statistics. The first one documents that we are looking at a population of overall, about 1% of the population is trans. Trans women are 2,000 times more likely to be murdered than gay men. 29% of trans people have been raped or assaulted by someone known to them. Nearly half of trans people have been raped or assaulted more than once. And 82% of trans people do not report their abuse or sexual assault to the police. Why might they not report to the police? We don't have any issues with police, right? Not just Salem, but I'm just saying, in general, no one's ever heard of any issues with police, right? Police are totally socially engaged and culturally sensitive all the time, right? One 2-hour class in police academy training does not, over a 30-year career, does not necessarily penetrate to understanding fully the challenges that trans women face or trans people face. They're not believed, they're misgendered. They might be gendered and then jailed accordingly. They're often perceived as the perpetrator rather than the victim. They're not believed. LGBTQI. Intersex. The old term, hermaphrodite, super offensive now, way outdated. Again, I'm making you hip. You're welcome. Intersex. So remember that you're born, the doctor yanks you and says it's a boy or it's a girl. And some of those internal reproductive organs and external sex characteristics may be ambiguous. There's like over 20 different types of intersex characteristics. So there's not one set, but what this really looks like is the doctor saying to the parents, your kid is born with characteristics of both male and female sex characteristics. And most often, it's botched external genitalia. Most often. So it's botched, it's malformed, it's just something that didn't grow right. And based on that external genitalia, an entire presumption of a gender identity is kind of laid on top of that. Doctors will recommend it will be easier for you to raise your child as female. Female is the default gender assignment. So oftentimes these kids grow up thinking I'm female, later may want to reproduce and told your body won't be able to reproduce because you have sex characteristics of both male and female sexes. Or you're raised female and think, but I feel like a boy. I feel like I'm in the wrong body. And oftentimes parents don't tell the kid until later. We're gonna watch a little video, another captioned video, that will help you understand a little bit more about folks who are intersex.
Hello, Mr. Khaled. Did you have a tax question?
I'm in that personal training game now. Can I deduct?
Raise your hands if you have testes.
Hang on. I think that the caption started. But I'm going to start that again.
Raise your hands if you have. Raise your hands if you have testes.
Is that a way to turn on the volume?
I'm Pigeon.
I'm Alice.
I'm Emily.
I'm Cypher.
And we are Intersexy.
Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of male or female.
I have XY chromosomes, but typical female genitalia.
I'm a girl who has testes and XY chromosomes.
I identify as a queer, gender nonconforming intersex person.
I identify as a Black intersex man.
Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. I mean, there's probably even intersex dinosaurs, if you think about it.
Transgender has to deal with your gender identity, whereas intersex has to deal with your biological characteristics.
Often, intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. They gave my mom the excuse that the internal testes were cancerous, that I would develop cancer.
They didn't even come up with an excuse, basically, in terms of a health-related reason. They instead just said it was about the appearance.
A lot of doctors are very uncomfortable with the idea that I have testes, and they're still trying to get them removed, but I'm perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with them.
They did a surgery to remove my testes and told my parents to take me home and just raise me as a girl, and I didn't find out about it myself until I was 12.
There aren't a lot of options, or medical providers don't explore other options. My mom would put me in dresses and she would be like, "Oh, aren't you so cute and you're so pretty?" And I would be like, "No, this is horrible." I was put on hormonal treatment, which consisted of estrogen and progesterone. I just wanted to belong. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be different. So even though I knew something felt amiss, I conformed. He was very condescending. He was like, "You intersex activists don't know what you're talking about."
It's difficult for intersex people to find each other because from an early age we're told not to talk about our bodies.
I did feel like I was the only one.
My doctors always told me there was nobody else like me, and so it just perpetuates a vicious cycle of shame and stigma that we can't break out of. I would tell another intersex person that you are worthy, you are lovable.
Your body is beautiful, you're beautiful.
Intersex people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them.
I know you feel like you might not be able to get through this. I know you might have really dark thoughts, but I want you to know that meeting other intersex people and finding a community or a support group can be one of the most important aspects in your healing process. And we're out there, we're out here, we're here. And I just hope you can find us.
Oh, something's still on. Ah. I hope that's not going to keep running in the background. Hang on 1 second, just to make sure this isn't going to keep running. Close all tabs. Okay. That's not the right slide. Hang on, folks. Ooh, how are we all doing? Will that work? Yay, okay. All right. Oh, there is an organization that you can look at for more information online, isna.org. It's Intersex Society of North America. There's some good information for folks. No, you have to copy down every slide. No, of course I'm going to make it available. Yeah, you can definitely take, it will be linked. Dave has already taken care of that, I believe, yeah. Two-spirit, have you heard this term before? Okay, this is a term that has come out of indigenous tribes and Native American populations that people who identify as trans, and some have extrapolated to include all queer people, are really seen as wise seers and sage counselors in tribal culture because they embody two spirits, the female perspective and the male perspective. So they are actually given more of an exalted and reverent status, and people will come to them for guidance, and they can because they embody both understandings of the female perspective and male perspective, they're more regarded. And something that I think is so empowering to think that tribal culture has come around and understands the sacred identities of trans people, that they do have experience being enculturated and socially conditioned as one gender identity, knowing that there was always this internal struggle because they really identified with this other gender identity. This is a fun picture, right? That really articulates the spectrum of sexual orientation, of biological sex, of gender expression, of gender identity. You can kind of see, maybe you fun times would plot yourself differently, right? Like, I identify as a woman. My gender expression can certainly vary from feminine to maybe more androgynous, depending. My biological sex is female. My sexual orientation is definitely bi towards homosexual, which is definitely more on the queer end. Just a fun picture. There's a lot of different versions of this. This is a good introductory version. There's gender unicorns, which you might find online, which are super fun, but as more advanced, and this is a good introductory one. This, I'm gonna let you watch this on your own, given our time and remaining time. But if you watch the Caitlyn Jenner special, when she was interviewed by Diane Sawyer about a year and a half ago, there was an accompanying video that was very short, but really encapsulated all the terms related to gender identity and expression in a very clear way. But I'm just going to hold off on that given the remaining time that we have. Let's switch to talk about outdated terms. Again, I want you to leave super hip and way up on the terminology, so let's go through those right now. I bet this first one will actually surprise you. What? That's outdated? Yeah. So the term homosexual, I use it when I'm talking about the Kinsey scale. I use it when you see that spectrum, but I don't actually use it to talk about the gay community anymore. And usually I say LGBT, but the term homosexual got co-opted by anti-LGBT people because homo and sex sounds really salacious. And so they like to use that word again and again and again, those homosexual activists, homo sex, homo sex, homo sex. So the queer community, we didn't have a meeting. We had a parade. No, just kidding. But we talked about it and we said, we're not using that term. You go ahead and keep that pretty much. So I think people use this term thinking, I want to be politically correct. I want to make sure I'm using the inclusive language. But the more hip language is like LGBTQ, all of the alphabet that is. And this is just kind of more passé now. Well, I think you all know that this term's outdated, right? Lifestyle. I mean, I wish I had this glamorous lifestyle, but the alternative lifestyle that queer people have is checking Facebook, is texting friends, is going to work, maybe taking their kid to soccer practice, cooking dinner, and watching SVU, Modern Family, Survivor. I don't know that you heard anything super alternative about that. Some of you probably do that. You're not gay, unless you are gay, and that's fine too. But that alternative lifestyle really implies choice. And that's language that really is suggestive of, will these people choose this lifestyle? My life isn't that different than people who are heterosexual. It just really isn't. But there is this presumption. And this term kind of came out in a big way in like the 80s and 90s, but it has kind of evolved out. People will say, I don't agree with your lifestyle. I'm like, yeah, I don't agree with your lifestyle. But I'm just teasing because what does that look like? We all get up, we may watch the news, we may check in with friends on Facebook and all that stuff, and we do the things that we do in our day, but it's not particularly like gay. I'm not like waving a rainbow flag throughout my day. That doesn't change it. I don't know what this alternative lifestyle business is all about, but this is outdated and offensive. Back in my day, when I was coming out, this was the term that we used to talk about sexual orientation. We used preference back then. So if you still use that term, just know that it's outdated. Now it's perceived as offensive, right? Because it has that suggestive choice implied. But now we use sexual orientation. We get that. So I have been a part of that language. Back when I was coming out, it was really lesbian, gay, and bisexual. And then we added the T and the Q, and more of those letters have come into the fold. I already told you about this, so you already know. You're so on board with this, right? You know, this is the outdated term for people who are cross-dressers. I will say, the only permissible time, the only CM Hall sanctioned time you can use this is if it is in reference to Rocky Horror Picture Show. And then you're permitted. That's okay. Always offensive? I'm not even going to say them out loud. You can just read them. Always offensive. Transsexual is a fading term because it used to be meant for people who have undergone and completed some surgical procedure, some medical procedure to where they have aligned their physical self with their psychological sense of self. And it really just felt more like it filled into the trans umbrella of, it doesn't really matter if you have access to surgically, hormonally, medically modify your gender, because some people don't choose to do any of those things, and they still may identify as trans. So for that, this term is kind of evolving out of the language, and in place of it, just trans is a good default. Next category, terms that we use in community, in the LGBTQIAA community. LGBTQQ. Questioning. Someone who's questioning their sexual orientation, someone who may be questioning their gender identity. That comes at all ages and stages of life. I notice it's happening younger and younger, but I still hear stories, like I heard a story yesterday. A friend of mine, her niece, who female identified, was married to a man, just came out to her family saying, I fell in love with a woman. That can happen at any age and stage. And we already set up the framework of attraction and all those ways that we're attracted to one another. We can't predict that. The heart wants what the heart wants, right? It's a part of the identity development stage, and that can change. You know, that also changes with gender expression. Like you might, I know people who maybe decided to just kind of change how they present their gender. Maybe they wanted to dress more masculine. If they were female identified, wanted to dress more masculine. Maybe wear suits and ties. You know, they just felt better, and that really fit their internal sense of self. Or they're maybe female identified and they want to get more femmed up, more feminine. That can change too. But they're questioning themselves. And when we find out about it is maybe when they're coming out or like starting to externalize what they're thinking. Coming out can happen at any age and stage, and it's not a one-time thing. You know, maybe if you post it on Facebook, it's a one-time thing. I'm gay, and then you're done. But I don't think that happens, because we already saw how many states you can be penalized for if you openly identify. You know, those business and employers can make decisions that say, they can ask it in an interview. Are you gay? You could be perceived to be LGBT, and they could ask it and it'd be permissible. But coming out is a figure of speech, right? Coming out of the closet. And it's essentially like someone disclosing their sexual orientation or their gender identity. I identify as pansexual. I identify as trans. I identify as queer. I know you've known me to be in this relationship with a woman for 20 years, and I've identified as lesbian. Get this, I just fell in love with a man. Because it happens that way too. Another video that you can watch on your own. The closet, it's that place where we figuratively hide. You know, I work with a lot of college students, and they may be out on our college campus, but their parents can't know. because their parents are helping fund their education. And maybe their parents aren't as pro-LGBT. And maybe if they found out my son was a queer, they might kick him out of the house. They might shun them. 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ or Q. That's real. I get that people need to stay in that closet for work or for school and bide their time until they are safe and can self-support. I get that. That's real. Also get that a closet is economic. You might be in the closet for economic reasons. You know, like if you live in one of those states where you could lose your job if you came out. A dear friend of mine, Mary Beth, was partnered for 50 years with her spouse, for all intents and purposes, Evelyn, who went to high school with Elvis. Mary Beth is probably mid-80s right now. And she lived in Texas. Her and Evelyn lived in Texas. They were roommates. Mary Beth was a school teacher. Evelyn made dentures. And whenever Mary Beth would want to take someone to the holiday party for the school, she took the gay male couple who lived next door, and she took one of them, right? Because they couldn't be out. This is the 1950s. That couldn't happen. You had to do that. I get economic reasons, then and now. Outing. It's not we're going to the park. We're going to Busch Park for an outing. It's when you tell someone else's business. Whether you say like, oh, I heard that so-and-so. Now you all have license and permission to talk about me, be like CM is queer. Whoops, that's fine, because I'm out. I have no closet doors anymore. I have remodeled and I have a bonus room. It's delightful. Space, I put in a skylight, it's really great. But some people, that's a real thing. So you want to make sure that you have permission that they're out to talk about them. Sometimes people really have an internal struggle and a wrestle about their identity. And they cannot get to a place of peace about it. A lot of that's built in our culture around religion and what particular religions say about LGBTQ people, about it being a choice, about it being a sin, all that stuff. How do you interpret it? How liberally or how conservatively do you interpret Scripture? Other religions, not necessarily Scripture-based, also talk about this. And that can really throw people. Also culturally, like the African American culture and what it means for men, or the Latino culture, what it means for men. There's a lot of internalized homophobia. Some men particularly may have engaged in same-sex behavior, like sexual behavior with other men, but maybe they can't write that internally for some time. It's a process. My girlfriend, Oprah, I don't know if you know her, we're tight, Oprah Winfrey. She, had her talk show, which I was obsessed with. And a couple years before her talk show went off the air, she had these gentlemen on, African-American gentlemen, and they were all in like that silhouette, like they didn't want to show their face, and talked about how they were all having same-sex relationships with other men, but they were on the down low. It was essentially an identity development stage. They weren't necessarily, and Oprah was like, wait a minute, okay, does this mean but publicly, they were having relationships with women. And the women did not know that they were having these same-sex relationships as well. And Oprah was like, but wait a minute, doesn't that mean you're bi or you're gay? She'd come around to understanding LGBT people a little bit by then. And they were like, no, we're not gay. We're heterosexual, we just have sex with men. And it was a head scratcher, right? Because that doesn't make sense. Like, we're like, okay, I don't want to tell you how to live your life, but I feel like I'm trying to understand you and I want to be respectful. So then the last year of her show, she had the same men come on, no more silhouette, out there as a panel on her stage, and they're like, yep, we are gay. It was a process. There was internalized homophobia. Culturally, African American culture had all of these like really strict rules about you have to be super hyper masculine, super macho. And how did they comport that with their attraction for men? Internalized homophobia is pretty real. Because, let's think about this. We have a very masculine sport called football. I am positive, I'm sure we're positive, that 100% of everyone who plays professional sports is heterosexual, right? Maybe not. Maybe there's some internalized homophobia. And there's societal homophobia that says, don't be out. We know people come out after they play their careers, professional athletes, but there's a lot of internalized homophobia. We talked about cissexism, that assumption that everyone's cisgender. Heterosexism is an assumption that everyone is heterosexual, forgetting that LGBT people exist. There's also that people don't believe that sexual orientation is innate, is natural, that attraction is fluid and is diverse. Some examples of how heterosexual privilege manifests in society that gay and lesbian and bisexual folks may not necessarily have advantage to. This is a long list, but I'm going to emphasize just a few. Examples of heterosexual privilege. Not having to justify to others that your heterosexuality is not a choice. How many heterosexual people in this room have had to, defend your heterosexuality? How many heterosexual folks are validated in your religious traditions? How many heterosexuals are socially accepted? Ooh, sorry. Wait, go back. And how many feel completely open in all 50 states and abroad about your sexuality, and you don't fear lack of promotion or know people who fear getting promoted or don't have to be afraid that you might lose your job if someone knew about your relationship? That's real. It's palpable for a lot of people. I'm going to skip this because I know that there were a lot of new terms for you, but I'm going to move on to just re-emphasize that there are two groups of terms here. The asterisks on the slide means there's kind of overlay in both categories, but you see terms related to gender identity and expression on your left, and terms related to sexual orientation on the right. And queer is one of those that kind of toggles between both categories. And again, outdated terms on the right. We don't use these terms anymore, so you can take them out of your language. Terms that you can be all hip about, gay, queer, trans. Remember that last A? And you were like, what is this word? Ally. So whether or not you identify as LGBTQ, you can be an ally. I think this is what creates change. I think this is what gets us to more than 20 states that will actualize equality for LGBTQ folks. But an ally is an intentional partner, is an intentional community member who is active. Not saying you have to be at every pride parade, no. Because I don't think it's about the pride parades. I think it's about the other spheres that you work in, that you move through and you navigate in. Other spheres of communities where you're in, where you talk about your understanding of LGBTQ people and your support and your affirmation of those identities. An ally is a person who supports and honors sexual and gender diversity. Someone who will, when you hear a homophobic or bi or transphobic remark, challenge that. Ask a question about it. Not saying you have to do it at risk of your safety, but open a conversation. Working to kind of learn a little bit more, understand a little bit more about your own biases, about your own questions around this. Another link that you can look at on your own. Oh, so many questions, so little time, right? But a lot of them, I think, were answered. Before I get to the paper questions, is there anything that you're like, okay, CM, I gotta ask this one question before you leave. Wait, I see a hand, but I need to know where the mic is. Okay, yeah, great.
Hi, my name is Franca. Sorry if I have a cold, but I was in the pouring rain on Saturday, all day, doing the right thing. It's not so much that I have a question, is that I have a comment about my experiences. I've been active politically for a long, long time. And because I work in equality and social justice issues as well as other things, I have worked with lesbian a lot. And I encounter something that you as a representative of a community that I've encountered. And I've encountered kind of reverse discrimination. I've felt, because I was heterosexual and working side by side with them, I somehow felt overtly sometimes hostility because I was heterosexual. I don't know what I was saying or doing. My brother is gay. I frequented his friends in Castro in San Francisco. I mean, I kind of was oriented, and I still was treated not equitably. So I would like that to be addressed.
Well, I'm so glad. I do speak for all LGBTQ people at all times. So just in case you're ever wondering, what do LGBTQ people think? I'll give you my number. No, but I do think that that's probably accurate given time and how things have evolved. I don't think that's necessarily true anymore because the LGBTQ community has really woken up to understand that we are only going to make progress with our allies. And our allies are heterosexual folks, our cisgender folks. I'm an ally. I'm in the queer community, and I'm an ally. I'm an ally to heterosexual people. I'm an ally to trans people. I need you, if you identify as heterosexual, way more perhaps than you need me. But I need my friends, my brothers, my sisters, your brothers, your sisters, to be protected. And so I do think that that's changing. And also let's think about like the history of feminism and that movement. Like I can totally see how people are like, have that righteous anger of like, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you feeling more? And I think that's shifting. I'm of the opinion that I think if you find me delightful, you're much more going to be endeared to me to want to fight for my equality, to want to fight for my dignity, to want to speak up for me. If I came in here and said, all of you heterosexual, or whatever, I don't think I'm going to win friends. You know, it's that honey versus vinegar thing. And I've always felt that I've had more success in my lobbying endeavors in changing and opening hearts and minds when I am myself. And that's who I am. I'm not putting this on. This is who I am. But I do know that agitation and the forces for change takes all different types. I feel like I've been around enough folks that I think I have had a lot of success in making some change happen when we're establishing a covenant of good relations from the get-go and moving forward with that. Like, we are authentically committed to lifting one another up, you know, and seeing each other's dignity. And I get that some people are like, why aren't you doing more? And we need those people. They serve a purpose. We need to be woken up. I think I could say that the next 4 years we might be woken up a little bit more about folks who are marginalized, who are oppressed, and certainly disenfranchised societally. And LGBTQ people still fall in that marginalized and oppressed population in a big way.
My name is David. This, of course, has always been called aberrant behavior, but I'm interested if you have read about or heard about studies of other animals that have this type of thing.
Yes, and here's the thing. I've heard that too, and I don't know that I think it's a fair parallel to say that LGBTQ people's attraction should parallel to animal behavior, because I think that it's forgetting our humanity. If you're asking about are there homosexual partnerships and relationships in the animal species, absolutely, there's evidence of that. And attraction is a human construct. We are attracted to people. We don't have a way to communicate with animal species to say like, but are you attracted to that penguin? And can you talk to me about, is that a sensual attraction or an intellectual attraction? And that seems that it's more sex behavior based. But I don't want to minimize the legitimacy, and I don't want to invalidate human relationships that are heart-centered, and we are more complex as a species.